Unit 2, Developmental Psychology. Presentation 4, Cultural Variations in Attachment.
This presentation is concerned with the question of whether babies all over the world have the same attachment experiences. The reason for researching this question is related to John Bowlby's theory of attachment.
Bowlby claimed that a baby becomes attached to its mother figure because of an inborn drive. He also said that the key inborn process in forming a healthy, secure attachment lay in the way that the mother figure responds to her infant.
If Bowlby was correct about the attachment process being inborn, then we would expect to find the same process in babies the world over, because the effect of different child-rearing styles shouldn't matter.
For example, in most Western cultures, babies are brought up in a home with one or two parents, whereas in some other cultures, a much wider family circle are involved in child-rearing. If such differences or cultural variations affect how attachments form, then Bowlby's theory would be wrong. If attachment is an inborn process, then the development of attachment should be the same in all cultures, regardless of child-rearing practices. We'll start by looking at research that has demonstrated similarities across cultures.
Mary Ainsworth conducted a number of studies on attachment in different cultural settings. Her main study was conducted in America. However, before that, she observed infants and their mothers in Uganda. In both cultures, she found that maternal sensitivity was associated with secure attachment.
In other words, she found that mothers who showed more sensitivity towards their infants had infants who were securely attached, whereas mothers who showed less sensitivity tended to have insecurely attached infants.
How did Ainsworth work out whether an infant was securely or insecurely attached?
She judged that a securely attached infant was one who was reasonably content to wander away from its mother, whereas an insecurely attached infant clung rather closely to its mother. A securely attached infant was not too upset if its mother left the room, but an insecurely attached infant was either indifferent or distressed if its mother left the room. This was the basis of the special method Ainsworth developed to assess attachment, which she called the strange situation. The findings suggest that in Uganda as well as in America, secure attachment was caused by the same thing, namely maternal sensitivity. This suggests that the same process might underlie secure attachment in different cultures.
Another study that demonstrated cultural similarities was conducted in Africa by Edward Tronick and his colleagues. They observed a cultural group called the Efa. In this group, infants were cared for and even breastfed by different women. You might expect this would result in multiple attachments to all the different women rather than the infant forming one primary attachment.
Tronick found that primary attachments were formed in the Efa just as they were in American infants around the age of 6 months, despite the fact that the child-rearing process was quite different.
It makes you wonder why the infants did become so closely attached to their own mother rather than any of the other women who looked after them and even breastfed them.
Bowlby would suggest that the mothers took a greater interest in their own children and responded more sensitively to them, whereas the other women would have had less special interest.
One final study that has provided evidence of cultural similarities was conducted by 2 Dutch researchers, Marinus van Idzendoorn and Pieter Kroonenberg. They analysed the results of 32 studies of attachment that were conducted in different cultural settings around the world, comparing the percentages of secure and insecure attachments found in these studies.
Their overall conclusion was that the differences within cultures were actually 1.5 times greater than the differences between cultures. This suggests that cultural practices have little influence on attachment behaviour.
Let's look at the research that has found differences in attachment between cultures. The 2 studies we are going to look at both found variations in the distribution of attachment types. In America, Ainsworth found that most of the infants she studied were securely attached. The figures she found were 66% secure attachment and 34% insecure attachment.
In one German study, Karin and Klaus Grossman used the same method used by Ainsworth to assess infant behaviour.
The Grossmans found that only 33% of the German infants they studied were securely attached to their mothers, whereas 67% were insecurely attached, which is the opposite of what Ainsworth had found.
A study in Japan by Keiko Takahashi also found differences in attachment types. The percentage of secure attachments in this Japanese study was similar to Ainsworth's findings, but the particular difference was that there was no evidence of insecure avoidant attachment.
In the Japanese study, the rates of insecure resistant attachment were 32%, a very high figure compared to the 12% in Ainsworth's sample.
Evaluating research on cultural variations. One of the major problems with all of the research described is the issue of cultural bias. Fred Rothbaum has argued that attachment theory and associated research studies have a strong Western bias. This is not surprising, since most of the researchers have been American or British. Their views are largely a product of the individualist culture in which they live.
So that means that countries like America and Britain would be described as individualist, and many African countries and China and Japan would be collectivist.
The importance of this individualist-collectivist distinction is that it means that the outcome of secure attachment will differ. In America, independence is valued, and therefore a close secure attachment between mother and infant will lead to independent, adventurous behaviour.
So this means that the securely attached baby will become an independent baby because the mother values the former behaviour.
And the opposite would be true in a country like Japan, where dependence is more highly valued. In Japan, we might expect dependent babies to be the ones that are securely attached. In other words, secure attachment promotes the kind of behaviour seen as desirable by a particular society. The problem is that the strange situation equates independent behaviour with secure attachment. A willingness to wander away from the mother and explore is one of the characteristics of secure attachment, whereas signs of distress when separated from the mother is a characteristic of insecure attachment. The strange situation ignores the cultural meaning of the infant-mother behaviours. Dependent behaviour is normal in Japan, but not in America, and therefore the use of the strange situation technique might not be meaningful in other cultures such as Japan.
The same argument could be applied to the findings from Grossman and Grossman's study. The German culture requires keeping some emotional distance between parents and children, so infants do not seek closeness to their mothers, for example, greeting them enthusiastically on reunion. Thus, the German infants in the strange situation might just appear to be insecurely attached.
Whereas, in fact, their behaviour is a sign of secure attachment in that culture.
The key point is that different cultures value different behaviours. Whatever behaviour is valued by the culture is the behaviour that will be linked to secure attachment.
This actually doesn't challenge Bowlby's view that the attachment process is inborn, but it makes it meaningless to have one universal method of measuring attachment type, which is the strange situation. Unfortunately, that's what psychologists have tried to do.
The term imposed ethic is used to describe this form of measurement bias. That is, using a technique that is developed in one culture to study the behaviour of people in a different culture.
And just to finish with one final small critical point about the use of the term culture rather than country. When researchers claim to be studying a particular culture, they are in fact looking at people in a particular country. For example, the Grossmans studied infants in Germany. The infants in this study might actually have belonged to different cultures. There's an assumption that all these cultures would share the dominant German approach to child-rearing, but that assumption might be wrong.
This makes the conclusions from this research rather meaningless because we have actually not linked cultural variations to attachment behaviour. The psychologists have largely looked at country variations.
What can we conclude? At the outset, we said that if attachment processes are inborn, as Bowlby suggested, we would expect to find similarities or universals across cultures. However, if we find evidence of cultural differences in attachment, then this suggests that it is culturally determined child-rearing practices rather than inherited processes that affect attachment. The research suggests there are certainly many universals but also some differences, which suggests that cultural practices modify the attachment process.